So it's great to be here, and I'd like to thank Anna and this fantastic team for putting everything together, inviting me, and overcoming a lot of hurdles. And I'm really glad to be here. I should say that for too many years I've been writing a book about the Black Sea, and this was a great stimulus to go back to some of my reading. And I was actually in Odessa a few weeks ago, which also informs what I'm going to be talking about today, which is a theme which is very ancient but also extremely current. It's the Straits. It's about Russian-Turkish rivalry in the Black Sea. And here's another map of the Black Sea for you. We're down in the right. You know, the currents in the Black Sea mean that shipping tends to go kind of naturally anti-clockwise there. It's a sea with many peculiarities. Another one of these peculiarities is the way that fresh water flows in from the Danube from the north, and then out into the Aegean in the south. And then salt water comes in another current underneath from the south. So there's actually the Black Sea is actually two seas. It's this very surprisingly unsalty upper layer from all that fresh water, and this very deoxidized lower layer, which is almost dead, and very few organisms down there, which is actually a treasure trove for archaeologists, because it's almost pretty much any shipwreck over the last few thousand years has actually been preserved in the Black Sea. But I'm going to be particularly talking about the Straits, and here they are. So we're talking about this incredible geographical quirk, and never has the geo been more important in geopolitics, and we're talking about the Black Sea. We're talking about at the top, we've got the Bosphorus, which is about 30 kilometers, 20 miles long, which goes right through the heart of Istanbul. And also on the left, we've got the Dardanelles, slightly longer, about 60 kilometers or 40 miles. Those two form the Turkish Straits, with the Sea of Marmara in between. And this was not always water, and just to take you back for a little bit of ancient history, disputes about when this happened. Was it 6,000 BC? Was it 7,000 BC? But the Black Sea used to be a lake, and what's now most of the northern and western shore, the Sea of Azov, was in fact dry land in about 8,000 years ago. And then there's lots of different theories as to how it filled up. The one which is most attractive, by two scientists called Ryan and Pittman, they say that at the end of the last ice age, glaciers melted, and what was the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Valley and the Sea of Marmara, which was the Valley of Marmara, suddenly filled up. And there was a dramatic moment when it all spilled over and rapidly flooded the Black Sea over about the course of a year. And of course, lots of speculation that this actually corresponds to the biblical legend of the flood of Noah. When we get to Yerevan, you'll look up at Mount Ararat and the legend that Noah's Ark came to rest on Mount Ararat, and lots and lots of Ararat and Noah terminology in Armenia. But
legend.
And obviously this geographical quirk leads to many historical consequences. Here, this is a picture from about 10 years ago. We're talking about heavy, enormous oil tankers going through the Bosphorus, which at its narrowest point is only 750 meters wide, through an enormous city of 10 million people, all these enormous international shipping. and about 20 years ago I actually made a BBC radio documentary about the Bosphorus, which involved climbing up on an oil tanker and that with a pilot. Every international ship that goes through the Bosphorus has to have an Istanbul pilot by law who stands with the captain and guides him through the Bosphorus. At one point there's quite a sharp right turn, the Kandili Bend it's called. And sometimes, occasionally, things go wrong. And this is a tanker which got stranded about 20 years ago, 15 years ago, and is being pulled out by tugs. Now, why is this politically important? Because this defines all the relationships in the Black Sea, because Turkey, before that, Byzantium, is the gatekeeper of the Black Sea. However weak Turkey is, it controls the Straits, more or less. And sometimes the Black Sea has been more open when Turkey has been a bit weaker or a bit more internationally minded. Sometimes the Black Sea is more open to international shipping. We're talking about antiquity when it was very much a Greek sea and all these Greek ports around the Black Sea. We're talking about the early Middle Ages when the Genoese and the Venetians had ports in Crimea. We're talking also about post-1991 when it was very much an open sea. And sometimes it's closed, and that happens when Turkey chooses to close the Straits or in time of war, as happened during the Crimean War, the First World War. And this is now regulated, or now when I say for many years, regulated by the Montreux Convention of 1936, which tries to resolve these contradictions. And amazingly, it's an incredibly relevant international convention because in 2022, Turkey invoked the Montreux Convention, particularly Article 19 of it, to close the Straits to military shipping, which means that Russian military shipping cannot transit the Black Sea. In fact, NATO, non-literal states of NATO can also not transit the state, and Turkey has basically closed the Straits since 2022 using the Montreux Convention, which when you start to read it, it has lots of bizarre references now to the League of Nations and so on, but is still an active convention in the world. And it's a convention, any convention on that strait tries to resolve various contradictions. One is this geographical quirk. I mean, it's not the only straits in the world. This between the sovereignty of the country that dominates the straits and so-called innocent passage, which is international shipping's right to go through it. That's one contradiction which the convention tries to resolve. The other is the rights of littoral, meaning the states, meaning the 6 states that border the Black Sea, and non-littoral states. Obviously, littoral states have more rights and privileges to access the Black Sea, but that currently really only applies to civilian shipping, not to military. And the third contradiction is between the claims of Russia and those of Turkey, which is, I think, the main theme, which has really been, and here I'm going to be treading on some of the ground or some of the water that Valentina has already introduced. Basically, since the 1690s, this Turkish-Russian rivalry over the Black Sea, which continues to this day. And I've been struggling to think, if anyone can win a prize by answering this question, is there any war since the 1690s on which Russia and Turkey have been on the same side rather than either neutral or on opposite sides? I can't think of one. This is an incredibly enduring rivalry, sometimes managed, sometimes not, over strategy, over ideology, over dominance. And over that period, Russia has traditionally been the stronger power most of the time, but Turkey has had this ace up its sleeve. It's been the gatekeeper to the Straits. This obviously wasn't the case always. Pre-17th century, there was a slightly different international configuration. Those lands in what's basically southern Ukraine and southern Russia now were the so-called wild field. It was the steppe, it's the Eurasian grasslands, which were dominated by nomadic civilizations, the Tatars, the Crimean Tatars, latterly also the Cossacks. But gradually that kind of buffer state disappeared, and Muscovy moved south. Muscovy became Russia, as you've heard. And from basically the end of the 17th century, this has been the dynamic. Just before that, in the latter 2 or 3 centuries, between 1453, the Ottoman capture of Constantinople, and 1774, Valentin's already referenced the Treaty of Kujuk-Kainaja. The Black Sea was basically an Ottoman lake. The Ottoman Empire used it to extract resources. It controlled every single inch of the Black Sea shore, and it was an enormous source of revenue for the Ottoman Empire that it could extract, customs duties, taxes of anyone who wanted to use the Black Sea. Russia broke that monopoly in 1774 when so-called Christian ships were first allowed to use the strait, principally Greeks. And there's obviously, as Valentina has mentioned, there's a religious dimension to this as well. And obviously you've already heard about Crimea, and I'm going to say a little more about that because I think the ousting of the Crimean Tatar Khanate in 1783, 1784 by Catherine the Great was a hugely significant moment in which Russian power changed, as we've already heard. I think exceptionalist is a very good word to apply to Russia, and it's a word that applies to several powers around the world. The United States, obviously, China, used to apply to Britain and France, possibly less so as well. But this feeling that you have, that you are in a class of states which has certain privileges in the world that smaller states do not have. And I think Russia very much aspires to that exceptionalism. And I think it was in Catherine the Great's reign that we can see this symbolic expansion of Russian power. As Valentina has said, it's laying claim to territories with symbolic value, where we see really Russian imperialism emerging in the modern era. And one could possibly date it to 1787, which was the year that Catherine the Great sailed down the Dnieper, and Potemkin organized these amazing spectacles on the shore, which were disparagingly called Potemkin villages. But I don't think Potemkin would have pretended that they were permanent. They were just spectacles to accompany Catherine on the way, and then arrived in Crimea, symbolically arrived in the palace of the Crimean Khans in Bakhchisarai, sat in the throne, and was crowned Queen of Tavrida, and said, I don't think she actually did this, but said that she could take a bath in the Black Sea. I think so. I think possibly that is the moment we can, I would contend that we can date this kind of new Russian imperial exceptionalism from. And let me show you a slide which is from 1779. Here we are. This is Catherine the Great's second grandson, Constantine, a symbolic name, obviously named after Constantine, as in Constantinople. And this was a kind of commemorative coin for his christening. And we've got, actually, maybe some of the historians in the room can help me, who we've actually got here. We've obviously got Catherine. Is that, I'm guessing that that's Constantine saint, the Byzantine emperor, on the right, but I don't know who that would be on the left, with the anchor. But notice Hagia Sophia, Saint Sophia on the right, the obviously the famous Cathedral of Constantinople, and notice that it's got, you can just about see it in my slide, it's got a cross on top rather than a minaret. So this is, again, a symbolic claim that this is not Istanbul, this is Constantinople, it's Tsargrad, it's a place that we are actually laying claim to. And in this rather asymmetrical contest in the Black Sea, the Ottomans are not, possibly they talk a bit about taking back Crimea, but they're not laying claim to possessions in Russian territory. It's always the other way around. The Russians are laying claim to what is currently in Ottoman territory. Does anyone come up with who that might be on the left? Oh, well, anyway.
Sophia?
Is it?
Is it Saint Sophia?
Ah, Saint Sophia, yeah. Or Helena, possibly, yeah. Yeah, okay, anyway. But obviously this Russian expansionism alarms the other powers of Europe, and there is, I think, a counter-tradition arises in this period, which continues to this day, about containment of Russian ambition. And Britain is, I think, the leading actor, my own country, in this pushback against Russian power. And obviously, the British are extremely alarmed in the 1820s when the Russians reach Edirne, Adrianople. Edirne is actually on the top of your picture on the Bulgarian border, Adrianople. So the Russians actually reached there in 1829, and that was 1828, and there was the treaty signed. But that was, I think, the British began to be pretty much alarmed from that point. And then you have statements like this, published in the New York Tribune. "We're astonished that in the current discussion of the Oriental question, the English journals have not more boldly demonstrated the vital interests which had rendered Great Britain the earnest and unyielding opponent of the Russian projects of annexation and aggrandizement. England cannot afford to allow Russia to become the possessor of the Dardanelles and Bosphorus. Both commercially and politically, such an event would be a deep, if not a deadly blow at British power." And again, we're talking about, now, who's the author of this quote? I think Ron's going to tell us.
Maybe Engels, but Karl Marx.
Karl Marx. This is actually
Engels
Karl.
wrote many of those pieces.
This is Karl Marx, who a lot of 20th century Russian history has erased the fact was a deep Russophobe and was firmly supporting Britain in the Crimean War and the Tory government. So this is actually, yes, this is Karl Marx in 1853. And there's another nice quote, if we've got a moment, from not on your slide. "It's evident that not only a very large trade, but the principal intercourse of Europe with Central Asia, and consequently the principal means of re-civilizing that vast region, depends on the uninterrupted liberty of trading through these gates to the Black Sea." So again, this is again Marx talking about how we need to keep the straits open and not let the Russians take control over it. As Valentina and Ron have already told us, the 19th century is a century of increased Russian ambition. The theme of Tsargrad is one which is a favorite of the Pan-Slavists, who are kind of, yoking their Pan-Slavic vision to the idea of Russia as the heir of Byzantium. And again, in 1878, the Russians reach Adrianople. Again, they do not advance on Istanbul. But they actually signed the Treaty of San Stefano, which is actually on the Sea of Marmara. So it's now a suburb of Istanbul. They're pretty much within a few miles of the center when that treaty is signed in 1878. And that's, again, it's the British and the French who are trying to restrain Russia at that point and manage to, and propping up the sick man of Europe, the Ottoman Empire, for that purpose. Under that treaty, incidentally, the town where we now are, Batumi, was passed from the Ottomans to the Russian Empire. So that was another effect of that treaty. But I have a quote here from Dostoevsky saying, around that time in 1878, "Constantinople must be ours. It is not only the magnificent port, not only the access to the seas and oceans that binds Russia so closely to the resolution of this fateful question, nor is it even the unification and regeneration of the Slavs. Our goal is more profound, immeasurably more profound. We, Russia, are truly essential and unavoidable, both for the whole of Eastern Christendom and for the whole fate of future orthodoxy on the earth, for its unity." So this is Dostoevsky setting out, again, the blending of the strategic and the ideological here. So just to move forward, the Straits continue to be important. And in the First World War, if Britain had, in the Crimean War, had supported the Ottomans in closing the strait to Russian naval power, suddenly in the First World War, things have flipped. Britain is now the ally of Russia, and the straits are closed by the Ottoman Empire, and Russia needs access, and Britain is suddenly doing exactly the opposite. It's landing this force at Gallipoli, this disastrous force with huge Australian contingent, tens of thousands of lives lost. The Turkish defense led by Mustafa Kemal, later to be Ataturk, and this unsuccessful campaign in 1915 to force the Straits, in which I know very little about it. My great uncle, actually, on my mother's side, also participated and was wounded. So we're seeing, again, the significance of the Straits, but in a different configuration. And at the end of the war, obviously, the Russian Empire collapses. And let me read you another quote from my Black Sea reading, a memoir by a Cossack officer in the cavalry division, the so-called Waal division of the Russian army in the First World War. Everything is falling apart in 1917, and he travels to Yerevan, which is now Tallinn, and he sees a Bolshevik sailor committee in charge of all the shipping in the port there. And he sees a notice pinned on the door. And the latest resolution of the sailors' committee, it was a long, scrawly document. The last paragraph was amusing. "We have resolved that we do not need any straits and that we don't want to eat fish." Kunakov says, "I could not make head or tail of it." His brother explains, "They mean that they don't want Russia to demand the freedom of the Straits, the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles as a condition of peace. The second part is self-explanatory. They want meat for dinner." But the Sailors' Committee is saying, in order to achieve the revolution, we have to give up on this historical claim over the Straits. And obviously, the Bolshevik Revolution succeeded. The Bolsheviks initially at Brest-Litovsk conceded enormous amounts of territory. Batumi was briefly controlled by the Turks in 1918 before the Allies began to take things back. And in 1918, 1919, we can talk about this tomorrow, it was actually the British who were the major power in the Black Sea after the collapse of Russian power. And the British controlled Istanbul, and there was this mass exodus through the Black Sea ports of the old regime to Istanbul. And I think possibly the great irony of this story is that the Russian aristocracy did occupy Istanbul in 1918, in 1919, 1920, but in exile because they were fleeing. So for a couple of years, suddenly Tsargrad was realized de facto under British control. All these Russian aristocrats living in Istanbul, but obviously in 1921, 22, 23, the Turks took back control. And just get back to the significance of this and the Treaty of Montreux signed in the Convention of Montreux signed in 1936 was I think a successful piece of Turkish diplomacy to push back against the idea that the Straits should be an fully international waterway. It was backed at the time by the European powers, and Turkey has held on to that right doggedly and jealously ever since. And there was a strong effort in 1945 at the Yalta and Potsdam conferences to change this regime, both by Stalin and by Churchill and Roosevelt. They both of them, all three of them, actually said at those conferences that the Montreux should be resolved. But what saved the Turks was that, on the one hand, Churchill and Roosevelt thought that the Straits should be more internationalized and Turkey should relinquish control, whereas Stalin was assuming this age-old Russian maximalist demand for control of the Straits. So although they both agreed on the revision, they wanted to take it in different directions, and the status quo was preserved. And this is even what Churchill, possibly remembering his attempt in 1915 as the Secretary of the Navy to force the Straits, was quite sympathetic to Stalin. And at Yalta he said it was impossible to accept a situation in which Turkey had a hand on Russia's throat. But Turkey managed to preserve the regime, and that's absolutely critical today because what's happened in the Black Sea in the last 3 years has been a bit overlooked. Ukraine has obviously lost an enormous amount of territory to Russia, but Ukraine has actually pretty much had the upper hand, even won, one might say, the struggle or the maritime battle on the Black Sea, despite not having a navy. Its use of maritime drones has decimated the Russian Black Sea fleet, including its main flagship, the Moskva, in 2022. That, in turn, meant that the Russians could no longer attack Odessa. Odessa is still under attack from drones, as it was under attack when I was there a few weeks ago, but no attempt no sustained attempt to take it from the sea, as happened in early 2022. And the fact that the Montreux Convention applies, that Russia cannot re-equip its Black Sea fleet through the Straits, is absolutely crucial strategically and economically for Ukraine. 80% of Ukraine's agricultural produce and 50% of its non-agricultural products exit through Odessa. It's absolutely key to Ukraine's economy. And again, that's a lot to do with this whole complicated history of the Straits. And just in close, to say a few words about Turkey and this war, because we can see many continuities, I think, in Turkish policy over the years. And I would say Turkey wants to do 5 things in this war. It wants to keep Montreux, keep control of the Straits. It wants to contain Russia, contain Russia's ambitions, as it has for the last several hundred years. It also wants to continue to trade with Russia. It sees Turkey is very happy to have Russia as an economic partner, even though it may be a political rival. Turkey gets most of its gas from Russia. The only gas pipeline that's now running from Russia, the main one, is Turk Stream across the Black Sea. So there's also that paradox. I think Turkey definitely doesn't want Ukraine to lose the war against Russia, but I think there's a quirk here that also Turkey's, and here we see the traditional Turkey anti-Western bias. So I think Turkey also does not want Russia to lose against the West either. A couple of scholars, Fiona Hill and I can't remember, I think it was possibly Kemal Karashi, wrote an interesting piece about 20 years ago calling Russia and Turkey the axis of the excluded, that they differed on many things, but they converged in feeling that they were excluded by the West, and they have some tactical coordination on that, if nothing else. So I'll stop there, and hopefully I'll welcome your questions.